Thank you so much, Toby. And before we actually begin the regulator panel session, it's really my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this panel. We are honored to have Commissioner Annie Caputo with us, who was sworn in as Commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission on August 9th, 2022, and is serving the remainder of a 5-year term ending June 30th, 2026. Commissioner Caputo previously served on the NRC Commission from 2018 to 2021, which I think is pretty unique. Commissioner Caputo has over 2 decades of government and private sector experience in nuclear energy and security policy. She has distinguished a career as a nuclear engineer and policy advisor and has made significant contributions related to federal nuclear energy policy. So it's my honor to invite Commissioner Caputo.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I have to start by saying, as a commissioner with the regulator, my appearance today is not an endorsement of Core Power or an advocate for their efforts, but I will say I am very excited to be here today. This is an amazing topic. Very fitting that we are in the energy capital of the world and home to world-class ports to discuss this topic today. Admiral Richardson started by opining on the days gone by. I'm going to do a bit of the same from a very, very different angle, though. When I graduated from nuclear engineering school in the 90s, the civilian nuclear industry was in decline. There was a set of premature plant closures, and us graduating students were basically counseled that the future for us and our careers was likely going to be in decommissioning. Yet, here we are today, quite a while later, poised for a technology leap with a range of new designs, a variety of uses. So I want to just retrace the steps of how did we get from the 90s to where we are today. Aside from the early shutdowns that were happening in the 90s, competition came to the wholesale electricity markets, and this really set the stage for a profound change in the nuclear industry and how it operates. It really gave an economic impetus to improving operational performance, safety performance, reliability, and really created set the stage for driving economic value and stabilizing the economic viability of the industry. And you can see that today. I think the movement that began in the 90s is really reflected in the capacity factor for the industry today of 93%, which is, I think, pretty amazing for the industry. Fast forward to 2005, Congress passed incentives to spur new construction. At the same time, roughly, price of natural gas started climbing, which in those days, that was very much a head-to-head competitor for electricity supply to the grid. So that combination made new nuclear an attractive option, and this drove interest in filing applications for new reactors for a total of 28 new units beginning in 2007. But 4 years later, by the time the first licenses came out, price of natural gas was already falling. Only 4 units began construction and only 2 actually entered operation, and those are the Vogtle units in Georgia that were mentioned earlier today. And then, of course, this was followed then with another series of premature closures. So by 2020, enthusiasm for small and advanced reactors and the push to decarbonize was really giving new momentum for nuclear energy. And of course, over the last 2 years, we've seen electricity demand grow. We've seen that growth itself accelerate. And now the view that the need to power AI is really becoming a national security issue. So what can we learn from the renaissance that fizzled, and why is our current situation different? First lesson is that construction time and cost make it difficult for nuclear to compete with natural gas. Not impossible, but it makes it difficult. However, the scale of electricity demand may lead to robust opportunities for development for both technologies and even some synergies with nuclear energy supporting oil and gas operations, which Greg talked about earlier this morning. The other lesson is that the NRC does not move at the pace of business. It's hard to imagine a government agency ever being nimble enough, as nimble as the private sector anyway, but we've got to do better. And Congress's passage of the ADVANCE Act last year is recognition of that. So why are things going to be different this time around? And I really think it's a confluence of factors. We see a rise of small and advanced reactors of many different types. There's a push to decarbonize, strong demand for power across the country, and the size and scale of the industries interested in deploying nuclear technology are significantly larger than the usual utility owner-operator model that has existed today. So all of this comes together, I think, and really positions nuclear industry for a technological leap, which is why we're here today. Maritime application, something that hasn't been seriously considered for a span of 40 years, is now brought us all here today for this conference. And it's just one facet of this technological leap. So how would the NRC go about licensing floating nuclear plants or civil nuclear propulsion? And I'll start with two historic examples, both of which have been touched on today. But I'll go into a little more detail. The nuclear ship Savannah was authorized and built in the late 1950s. And NS Savannah was licensed by the Atomic Energy Commission, which was a predecessor to the NRC. The ship operated from 1965 to 1972. While she was active, she visited 45 foreign and 32 domestic ports as part of the Atoms for Peace project. Her status as part of Atoms for Peace meant that she was owned by the Maritime Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce, so it makes her unique with regard to some of the issues that would have to be addressed for maritime civil nuclear energy in the future. So currently, Savannah is completing her decommissioning and license termination process. The other example is the manufacturing license, which was mentioned earlier this morning, for offshore power systems issued by the NRC in 1982 to Westinghouse. That license was for 8 floating nuclear power plants that were envisioned to be moored off the East Coast and provide power to New England. But the plants were never built, although there did exist a memorandum of understanding between the NRC and the Coast Guard regarding how they'd be licensed and operated. There have been other uses of maritime nuclear energy, of course, obviously, in the Navy, in several nations. There are a few other examples of civilian nuclear cargo ships and icebreakers, as well as some floating nuclear power plants. One, which was also mentioned this morning, was the U.S. Army Sturgis, which was sent to Panama and to support the canal between 68 and 76. None of these clearly lays out how we should resolve questions that arise regarding licensing and regulating floating nuclear power plants. Under the Atomic Energy Act, a license is needed to possess, use, import, or export nuclear technologies and equipment with certain exceptions. NS Savannah and the Sturgis were owned by the United States government and therefore were not exported or imported. Sturgis was under Department of Defense and met additional license exceptions as well. So whether a U.S. flagged nuclear power vessel is exported when it leaves the territorial waters of the U.S. or enters the territorial waters of another nation is something that must be settled. Similarly, a foreign-flagged nuclear-powered vessel is it imported when it enters the territorial waters of the U.S. under innocent passage, as described in Article 23 of the Law of the Sea? Once imported, would it fall under the regulatory jurisdiction of the NRC while in a U.S. port? The considerations for floating nuclear power plants that provide electricity rather than propulsion could be somewhat simpler, as there would be less of a need of consideration of multiple imports and exports. Presumably, a floating nuclear power plant could operate moored in the territory of a single country for its entire lifetime, and subject to regulation by only one regulatory agency. This could be as simple as having a factory licensed to produce a floating nuclear power plant in the same country, as well as a facility for refueling and decommissioning at the end of its life. If a floating nuclear power plant produced in one country operated in another country and potentially fueled or decommissioned in a third, the issue of licensing and regulation for each stage of life and the transition of regulatory authority between agencies would also need to be addressed. We have some precedent that we could look for with things with regard to issues such as quality assurance for major components like boilers and pressure vessels produced in one country and used in another. But we have not needed before to address the import or export of operating reactors per se. As I mentioned, the Sturgis was owned by the Department of Defense at the time and not licensed by the NRC. So that is a range of particular questions. I think in my mind also generally, I would draw a parallel between a floating nuclear power plant, although it will have its unique issues, would end up with a similar licensing path to microreactors, which would entail a license for the manufacturing facility itself, a license for transportation from that facility to where it is operated, a license for operation, and a license for transport, either for refueling or decommissioning to a last facility. So this to me represents a series of steps, and these are feasible under our existing licensing regime. But in the same way that we are seeing the industry undergo considerable innovation now, I think it also should give the agency pause that there's a need for us to innovate our decision-making as well. I would like to see progress toward finding a way to engage in batch licensing of identical units for identical uses in ways that we can manage and make decisions in groups or batches, one at a time. So that would involve a certain amount of standardization. But I think if we are looking at a situation where multiples of identical reactors are going to be placed, it's going to become, I think, a challenge for us to manage that volume unless we find a way to be more efficient and more streamlined in our decision-making. So that is just one item I think is really in common between floating nuclear power plants and microreactors. So I'm happy to take a few questions. I should also point out Sam Lee is staff person with the NRC and has the lead on floating nuclear power plants. So now I've just painted a bullseye on Sam. You can all corner him during the break. But he's currently the one responsible for building our institutional knowledge on this issue.
I don't know if I read this incorrectly, but is Texas challenging the NRC for SMR placement and approval? Is that right?
Great. Starting with an easy question. Yes, there is a case pending between Texas, the parties to it are Utah, Texas, and one advanced reactor vendor, and questioning whether we are overstepping our authority in licensing small reactors. And that's really about all I can say about it. But yes, that course is
Georgia is not challenging you. Just keep that in mind, please. Thank you.
Well, thank goodness for that.
I'm Clay Montgomery. Does the NRC have sufficient staff to handle what the 20-something different SMR designs that it's faced with, most of which require, molten salt cooling loops and has all sorts of new technologies that you just don't have in the light water fleet?
I will start by saying yes. We have teams of people that are reviewing a range of these designs. It's in pre-application. We're in pre-application discussions with a range of companies. So there is work ongoing. We don't have a lot of applications that are actually filed with us and under review, but we do see a map going forward of timeframes when we've been notified that we should anticipate certain applications coming in. So that gives us a certain amount of information that allows us to plan our workload. I think the question for me becomes, how fast does that curve turn up? And when exactly does that happen? Because certainly in the nuclear industry, the second mouse gets the cheese. The in saying these days is everybody wants to be a fast follower. Nobody wants to go first, everyone wants to go second. So that for us becomes a challenge in planning. We as a government agency budget 2 years in advance. So the sooner we can know what the workload is 2 years out, the easier it is for us to plan resources for that work. And I will get on my budget soapbox for just a little bit. I think most people probably have this vision of the agency, we are spending all our time licensing and inspecting. And the reality is that work is billed by the hour to those licensees and applicants that we're reviewing licensing work for and conducting inspections. That hourly work represents 20% of our budget. So while that is a core of our workforce, there is also a chunk of our workforce that is also doing other activities. So the nature of being able to bring those other employees to bear to handle a growing workload, I think is something that we need to look at a lot more closely as an agency, because we really, if you look in statute, licensing is the responsibility that is called out for us. So I really feel like the time is now for us to focus on our statutorily mandated licensing responsibilities and really make sure that we are focused on that and setting those priorities. And I believe we've got a great amount of capability to bring to bear there as long as we set our priorities. Now, as this activity grows and the licensing workload grows, there obviously will come a time where we will have to add staff. But to the extent that folks can let us know what that workload is going to look like, that enables us to make those calculations and plan accordingly. Thank you. Mikhail, thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Oh, I was going to say thank you very much for your fantastic presentation, and thank you for coming to join us. We're honored to have you here. I wanted to ask you about the MOU that was in place between the NRC and the US Coast Guard around these floating nuclear power plants off the coast of New England back in the 70s. Do you know if that MOU is still valid and in place? And if not, are there any discussions about putting that back in? Because it seems logical that both agencies need to be involved in floating nuclear.
I have not laid eyes on said MOU. It existed. Whether or not we can put our hands on a copy of it, I'm not sure where that stands in our archives. And this I am going to direct to Sam, because I think he's going to have to track that down. Interagency meetings were happening last week. Coast Guard was one of the agencies involved, as was NRC. So I would imagine one of the things that folks are doing now is retracing those steps, tracking down that document, and seeing exactly what that what was written and what the real vision was in terms of the division of responsibilities and how to draw a line. Our jurisdiction for the NRC, also butts up against the line with regard to FERC and responsibility for the grid being separate from responsibility for a nuclear power plant, but that's very clearly described and pretty easy to adhere to. So I'm hoping that whatever was envisioned previously with the Coast Guard would have a similarly a very clear definition point that allows us to manage our respective responsibilities. But Sam will be the source of history on that.
Thanks for your interesting presentation. I have a question about the SMR regulation. Although we refer to them as SMRs, their design can vary significantly depending on the reactor type. For example, different SMR use different type of nuclear fuel, such as liquid fuel or tracer fuel, and they are also different in terms of plant type and operating temperature. Because of this variation, developing regulation from start to finish could take several years for each reactor type, especially when considering their application in maritime environments. With that in mind, I'd like to hear either the NRC's official stance or your personal opinion. Is the NRC working on regulation for all types at the same pace, or is it prioritizing certain design that are expected to be developed more quickly?
So we have 2 regulations that are in place now. We have a third under development. Under the regulations we have in place now, we could receive an application and conduct a review. The challenge becomes there would be some time involved in that process in determining which of our regulations apply and which are irrelevant or need exemptions. And so that means that for individual technologies or a new application like maritime, we would basically be conducting something of a custom review using the relevant pieces of our existing regulatory framework. The third regulatory framework was intended to be technology inclusive and performance based to sort of get away from that regulation by exemption, custom review dynamic, and be applicable to a range of technologies and a range of uses. That's under development. It probably wouldn't be in place until 2027. So the answer is yes, we can do it with the existing framework, but there will have to be discussions to sort out what requirements actually apply depending on the technology and depending on the use.
Come on, Annie, don't chuckle.
Rod, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you. It's Rod Adams from Nucleation Capital. And given the focus on licensing as your statutory requirement, where you put things like coordinating with international bodies so that there's some sort of harmonization of regulations across the world so we can move ships from one place to another, or we can export SMRs to other countries, those kinds of things. Is there another agency that should be working on that if you're just focused on licensing?
Well, our export-import responsibilities are not just with the NRC. It's shared among several different agencies. So I think the responsibility for those international communications is not limited to us. I know our Office of International Programs engages in those kinds of activities, and I'm pretty sure that they've already been participating, say, in IAEA's ALICE project. So I expect that work will continue. That comes out of the taxpayer-funded portion of our budget. But I would expect that we will certainly be a robust participant in those activities as this framework gets shaped internationally. Okay, and I'm getting the hook. Thank you all for being such a gracious audience.
Thank you, Commissioner. I was happy to let that go as long as possible. I feel like that was a very unique opportunity to be able to kind of ask you questions directly, so I appreciate you opening yourself up for that. But at this point, we wanted to get into our regulatory panel, and it's a privilege of mine to be able to introduce our experts on the panel. First up is Mr. Scott Edwards. Scott Edwards is Core Power's Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and has over 30 years of experience in the transportation and waste area, including naval reactors experience. Welcome. Next up, we have Mr. Patrick Ryan, is a Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Class Society, American Bureau of Shipping, ABS. Prior to joining ABS, Pat spent over 20 years at the largest nuclear-capable shipyard in the U.S. designing nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers for the U.S. Navy. I haven't actually seen the other two panel members, but next up is CJ Fong, who serves as Blue Energy's Vice President for Regulatory Affairs, where he leads the development of a construction permit application and an operating license application for Blue Energy's technology. Prior to this role, CJ served over 2 decades at the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, most recently as the Chief of Staff to Commissioner David Wright. Glad you're here. And finally, we have Mr. Jan Hagen Anderson, who's the Regional Director for Maritime Decarbonization and Business Development Director, DNV Maritime. Mr. Anderson has over 30 years of experience in the maritime industry with a focus on propulsion systems and machinery. Welcome. So I think we had a lot of questions and interaction with Commissioner Caputo, but just to kind of springboard from that, I heard a lot of challenges personally with respect to kind of inter-country challenges in the regulations, but Core Power's vision is to build a floating nuclear power plant in the U.S. And so my question with that is, do you envision smooth sailing with that approach, or do you envision challenges with respect to potentially new NRC regulations or class regulations for performing that goal?
Nobody wants to touch this one, apparently. So I could speak on the part of class for a moment. One advantage that we have when you talk about kind of the international aspect, our set of rules will be consistent regardless of where the vessel is built or operates, because that's an advantage of being a global society. Relative to kind of where we see gaps and overlaps from an international perspective, we as we think about commercial reactors being deployed at sea, I think there's a big difference in the technology readiness levels that we'll see tested at INL, for example, versus, as I think Chris mentioned, what does it look like when it's on a ship? And the perspective of the international community relative to the readiness levels going from terrestrial to maritime will be important. And then kind of circling full circle back around to class, our understanding of where the interfaces exist, as Chris mentioned, we have an interface requirement in our own rules for what the reactor does for the vessel and what the vessel does for the reactor compartment is, I think, kind of that overlap piece of the Venn diagram that will need to really get fleshed out from an international perspective.
So I think Commissioner Caputo did a great job of explaining the regulatory options that are in place for licensing the reactor in the U.S. I wanted to talk a little bit about the NS Savannah that she mentioned, because I had an opportunity to go there a few years ago. And what was interesting was we found out that the folks that commissioned the NS Savannah, they didn't know what they didn't know, which is not that surprising for a first-of-a-kind technology. And so there were a bunch of things that came up that nobody had anticipated. For example, the maiden voyage was delayed by about 6 weeks over a labor dispute because the crew said, hey, we're in a riskier environment. I don't know what this radiation thing is. We should get paid more. And there was a dispute about that. The first captain of the Savannah also wanted to control the reactor. He said, I'm the captain of the ship. I'm responsible for the safety of everybody on board. I should be able to control the reactor. And the Atomic Energy Commission said, well, you're not a licensed operator, so you can't do that. So there's a back and forth about what the captain could and couldn't do in terms of the reactor. The compromise was he got a scram button or a chip button to rapidly shut the reactor down in his captain's nest. I'm sorry, I'm not a ship guy, but so you can the bridge. Thank you, appreciate that. So you can go there. It's quite interesting. He has this little button just sitting right there by his chair. It's still there. Well, it was there a few years ago. Maybe it's decommissioned now. So I think we're in that same boat right now. Perhaps we don't know what we don't know. I think we have a good regulatory framework in place, but we need to we collectively as a nuclear community, a shipping community, need to prototype some of these things. I think we'll find areas that we hadn't thought of. We can work that out as we go. But I think a prototype makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I was going to approach it a little bit from the nuclear side. Of course, with what Commissioner Caputo said, there are a lot of uncertainties with when you go into international waters, when you go into different countries, different ports, harmonization. There are activities underway at the International Atomic Energy Agency to harmonize regulations across different countries. I don't think that's going particularly well at this point. It's been very bureaucratic and slow. The IAEA has come up with this new program that McCall mentioned earlier today, the Atlas program, which is going to be an effort to try to get the international regulators, both in the maritime and the nuclear environment, together to work on harmonizing and figuring out who's got responsibility for what. When it comes to actual licensing, though, the licensing is actually done, and you're going to get a license from the NRC to operate the reactor. So you're not going to get it from the IAEA or anybody. So, there are rules. They're clear as 10 CFR 53 and other items come out. There will be opportunities to see if that works for nuclear bet. Nobody wants to be first, I think it's been said. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth on that. I would anticipate, to start with, there are going to be a lot of exemption requests. It's going to be a one-time, special authorization for the transportation activities. And eventually, as we've operated the first several of these, the regulations will then follow. I mean, that's basically how we got the regulations we have now. They went out, did things, and you got the approval, demonstrated it was good enough, and that was determined to work for a regulatory basis that was used. I would expect something somewhat similar to follow with maritime nuclear.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, my perspective is, and DNV's perspective is, of course, that one of the biggest challenges was mentioned is really about, decarbonization in the maritime industry toward 2050 and finding, technology and the solutions for that. So in that perspective, yeah, we're very eager to understand how nuclear energy on board ships can be used as a way to meet that challenge. I think the other perspective is, as I said, it's very important to bring in organizations like DNV and ABS in that rule, because we understand how to say our role as a recognized organization, help the flag states to maintain the national and international regulations, but also have the focus on the other system on board the vessel that needs to integrate with the reactor. I'm not an expert on reactor technology, and DNV will probably not license or have rules for reactors, but we will have rules for how that reactor system will integrate with other main functions on board a ship to make sure that it can operate safely anywhere and any place and under all the different conditions that a ship needs to operate on. And that's where we can offer our expertise.
Yeah, since I went first, I want to go last too. McCall brought it up today as well, but in the context of your question, how do we, deal with international differences? The NEMO NGO is another great place to go deal with that, and having some 50 members now, and
I was going to pitch that since my name up there says Nemo underneath it. So.
But that's another good, I think, resource for the community to go align.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up because I missed it when I went off on Atlas, but. Basically, NEMO is a nuclear energy maritime organization, and we do have 3 working groups right now that are focused on various aspects of this conundrum that we're in with trying to get clear regulations for this. So there is one working group, the first working group is maritime regulations. I'm looking, I don't see Meg Dowling, but there she is. Okay, so she's the chair of the first working group on maritime regulations. I'm the chair of the second working group on nuclear safety, security, and safeguards. And then there's a third working group called ANORAX, which is on insurance and liability. McCall is the chair of that working group. So we do have, as Pat said, 50 members right now in NEMO, and we're looking to expand, and we are developing relationships with the regulators. We're hoping to get NGO status at both IAEA and the IMO this year. We've actually had the Deputy Director General for Safeguards in the IAEA reached out to us this week and wants to schedule a Safeguard by Design workshop for NEMO members in March. So, there are these international forums because there are members from, I don't know how many countries, but from, at least 4 continents, if not 5 continents, are already members of NEMO. So that gives a good forum for us to get together and come up with reasonable and good solutions to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think what I heard is, we have good actions in place with respect to some of the international and inter-country challenges that Commissioner Caputo brought up. And then with respect to some of the domestic challenges, we can obviously use the precedents that are in place with respect to the early FMPP applications that came in the 80s, and then obviously U.S. Savannah application as well, and that success story, really. So that's excellent. So kind of shifting a little bit to class. So I know you had mentioned, Pat, the interface document that exists kind of between, nuclear regulations and class regulations and trying to understand that better. In your view, what is the #1 challenge with respect to moving forward with that kind of overlapping of regulations?
Yeah, good question. So maybe first let me clarify a little bit. So the requirements document that ABS put out back in October, first of its kind, calls out the need for an interface document to define the boundary between the licensing of the reactor and the classification of the vessel. So that's the interface document that you're referring to. It's not something that you can go look at now. It's something that you need to prepare as you enter into the class process. At least with ABS is how we've laid this out. I think maybe the more interesting question is less about perhaps the overlaps and more about the gaps. When we take a look at what's out there, we can see lots of, there's A491 has call-outs for management of waste. Is that appropriate? Maybe not. That's an overlap that we should deal with. From my perspective, that's not the bigger challenge. The bigger challenge is, what do we do about all of the regulations that are just missing or silent or don't treat a nuclear vessel at all? Chris mentioned ISM, ISPS code. The role of MARPOL in relationship to the management of carbon intensity has a huge impact on the advancement of nuclear because of the cost associated with the tax schema and or the cost of fuels in the future will make or break the economic story for nuclear. And those continue to be turbulent, and they don't treat any accounting for or scoring for nuclear. Chris elbowed me in the ribs and asked me to bring this giant prop up, so I guess I should talk about it. This report, ABS was proud to participate in from the European Maritime Safety Agency, published in November, so it's hot off the press. Flip to page 98, and for 11 pages of small bullets, you can see an itemized list of all of the regulatory gaps that we've been able to identify. It's a lot of work ahead of us to bridge those gaps.
Maybe just to add what Pat says there, I think there's a lot of work we have to do. There is sort of an incoherent and not really consistent regulation when it comes to how we apply nuclear propulsion on vessels. And really, what is the role of class versus what is the role of the national and international regulators? I think that is really a lot of work. We say that it's going to take 10 years for technology maybe available for use. So in the meantime, at least we can try to do that work within these organizations like NEMO, within IMO, with other international regulators, and come up with a framework that can actually be used to put that in. And DNV is, of course, also a member on NEMO and is working on understanding how we can contribute to the development of nuclear-propelled vessels and floating nuclear power plants.
So we're not a NEMO member yet, but maybe we could talk later on. I think there's some cause for optimism here. when I worked at the Nuclear Energy Agency, we did a workshop on international kind of harmonizing standards, things like that. It was before the IAEA launched their NESI initiative. And one thing we found that was really interesting was how the commercial airline industry did this. So if you don't know the story, as World War II was winding down, a number of countries realized, hey, this commercial flight thing could actually take off. But we need a common set of standards. We have to work together because if every country has their own set of air safety standards, pilot training standards, maintenance standards, it's going to render international flight kind of impossible. And so there was this massive gathering called the Chicago Convention. I learned, interestingly, a lot of countries had to fly to sort of, military craft or on a dark of night because the war was still going on. So people literally put their lives at risk to show up to this event. And they sat down and they kind of hammered out all these different things. Again, as I mentioned earlier, what does plane maintenance look like? What are the safety standards of the airplanes? Who's training the pilots? Even things like what are the sort of radio communication protocols? And so you have a kind of a cool situation today where you can have a plane that's built in one country, shipped to another country. It takes off there, it flies through the airspace of 5 or 6 different countries and then lands somewhere. And so I think we can do this. I think it's going to take a kind of big tent approach with a lot of folks, involved. But I think there's an opportunity here. And I think the commercial air industry has kind of shown us, blueprint for how to do that.
Yeah, what I heard is, there are challenges, but they can be overcome. And I heard a couple of analogies about going to space, sending an Da Vinci reactor. If we can do that, then we can certainly overcome some of these challenges.
But just like to make one additional point. From a class perspective, as we developed our own rules, we applied a lot of goal-based standards in our approach. And I think Part 53 for the licensing is taking a similar kind of goal-based approach.
Performance-based,
a little bit of flexibility. I think that's also a really important advancement to really kind of enable the community to adapt to how we need to manage the regulatory frameworks for licensing at the same time that technology is advancing. So I would call that out to everyone's attention as well.
There was a comment in the earlier panel about inefficiency in regulation. So my question is, in your view, are regulations inefficient? Can we be efficient with our approach to achieving our licensing goals?
Wow. Okay. So first disclaimer, I'm just going to talk about nuclear regulations, not like financial or just regulations in general. I think the NRC has done a great job over the last, say, 15 or 20 years of passing regulations that actually provide additional flexibility. It's something I think, frankly, is missing from the conversation right now in Washington about cutting red tape and reducing bureaucracy, both of which are important, of course. But the NRC has had rules like 5069, which allows for a more flexible approach to qualifying certain components. They've had rules that allow licensees more flexibility in terms of managing maintenance and things like that. And so, and Part 53, which of course Commissioner Caputo mentioned earlier. So I think at least at NRC, there's been a trend toward passing regulations that actually provide additional flexibility and efficiency. And I think that philosophy just needs to maintain going forward. There's got to be a certain level of safety, of course, but you can pass rules that allow licensees and applicants, which now I'm one of them, so I really appreciate this, more flexibility, less bureaucracy and red tape. So I kind of cringe a little bit when I see like, well, for every regulation that goes, every new regulation that's passed, we got to get rid of 3. I think it should be more focused on, can we pass regulations that actually protect society, but while also providing benefits to applicants and licensees?
I mean, from my perspective, the fact that we have moved much more towards a performance-based, goal-based type standards as opposed to prescriptive means, that gives us the flexibility that we need, and we just have to be able to come up with appropriate approaches to be able to demonstrate that we're doing that. The international regulations are, certainly an area that, we've been working on with NEMO to try to streamline those. We've encountered a lot of, bureaucratic resistance in that. Part of the discussion, and I think part of the reason that the Atlas program is coming around is to try to expedite processes at IAEA. I was at the general conference last year, and they were talking about how long it takes to revise an existing regulation, and the existing regulations take at least 5 years to get updated, more like 7 to 10 to get updated. So if we do identify that we need to make some changes, it's not going to happen very quickly there. So I know I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, but yes, there are opportunities to do that, but with the existing scenarios. But if we need to change the regulations, I'm concerned that it's not going to happen very quickly.
Can I just say something as well? Right. Yeah. So, I think, and this means from a class society perspective, of course, we are quite flexible and can be nimble in coming up with new technical standards that can be implemented. And I think if you look at what's happening in international, like with the IMO and even national regulation, that takes longer. But we do need that process. We've seen that, I think, even there, they have been more quicker in looking at the new challenges facing the maritime industry. So I hope, with NEMO and the work that's started, that can be more flexible well. And the final point I want to make is, I think the risk-based or goal-based performance standard is good. I think we also need to be clear on what acceptance criteria that we will need to be accepted. And that has to be set by the regulators, as well as we saw, for example, LNG as fuel, that there are different acceptance criteria in different jurisdictions. And that's also something that has to be clarified, because with the risk-based approach, there is a risk, to put it that way, that there might be not that different standards are always applied. So we have to be also careful that there are some prescriptive requirements that needs to be in place to make a safe implementation.
And maybe I'll close this question out with a couple of observations. First, when ABS puts out a set of requirements, vice rules, there's a little bit of a differentiation. And the reason is requirements or guides, which are optional, allow us to be nimble with respect to those rules. So we can change those. I won't go so far as to say weeks, so I think I have some staff in here that'll throw something at me, but months. That said, I think we all need to be a little introspective on the reason that the regulations and the rules exist in the first place. We are all in this room stewards of an industry that has a fantastic safety record, and we need to continue that. And as a mechanism to ensuring, Chris uses the term boundary conditions, to go implement new technology, they are very important. And certainly at ABS, we take them very seriously, because safety overall is number one. And if we really do want to make a difference with this technology in the future, we have to maintain that pristine safety record.
I have one more question. It wasn't on your prep sheet. I was debating asking it, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So there are 4.5 billion tons of uranium in the ocean. Are we really concerned about a sinking operating reactor? If there's no answer, that's fine. We can save it for our drop with the NRC.
Yeah. Well, I think, Pat was just talking about the safety record. We're all stewards of that, and we still have to be very cautious, and we can't just cut corners or do anything. We've got to do this right. We've got one shot, because that's one reason we have NEMO and industry groups like this, because one mess up by anybody in the industry can kill it for decades. I was going to college when Chernobyl happened, and that put the nuclear business back on its heels for a long time. All it takes is one, event like that could, kill the industry. So, yeah, it does matter. We can't afford to do anything like that.
Yeah, and a follow up on that, I shouldn't have been glib on the passing the question, but the role of ABS certainly is, safety and protection of people and property, but also the natural environment. And when I think, kind of more recently than Chernobyl, even Fukushima still continued to have water quality questions years after the event was in the rearview mirror. And certainly I think we can all agree in this room that we don't want that placed upon this industry as we try to do some real good with technology. So no, I don't think it matters how much uranium is in the ocean. We still care very much about making sure that these vessels are safe.
I would add two things. One is the uranium in the ocean is natural uranium, which is, fairly benign to human health. And then the other thing, kind of piggybacking on what my colleagues here said, one thing we saw, for example, in post-Fukushima, Japan, was the economic impact that people that were fishing had, because there was a public perception, hey, any fish from this area could be unsafe. And so there was a real life impact, whether it was a very small dose or not. Individual people were actually very adversely affected by that had nothing to do with the accident. So I think there's a nuclear safety issue, there's a maritime safety issue, but you can lose your contract with the public if you have one of these kind of accidents, and you can hurt people and their livelihood if you have an accident like that. So I agree. I think we can't just say, well, a core damage event and a ship is bounded by the volume of uranium that's already in the ocean. I just don't think that.
Yeah, I just agree with all my fellow panelists there. And of course, there is person on that ship as well. We got to think about that. And as I say, the maritime industry has tried to maintain a great safety record, and sometimes the perception is still that maritime is sort of a bunch of pirates out there, and we don't want to have that impression, because it's not the case. It's a very heavily regulated industry, both nationally and internationally, and we need to keep it that way. We need to keep it safe for the seafarers. We need to keep it for the people that risk their life to save people if they are in risk. And so I think that's in our DNA, everyone that works with maritime.
Very good. I think we have about 4 minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to questions from the audience. I think Admiral Richardson has a question.
Thanks. A terrific panel and a very lively discussion. I'd like to just go back to something that I touched on earlier, which is that we're not the only ones that are going to be putting these vessels to sea. And so, I'd just like your thoughts on what we might want to call a bit of a tension between maintaining safety always, right? Don't get me wrong there. I couldn't agree with you more about the need to be safe. However, 10 years to modify a regulation seems to me to be a bit excessive. And I think that there are nations out there that are going to build this technology and put it to sea who will not be that patient. They'll just do it. And so if you could maybe share your thoughts in terms of how do we manage that tension between the fact that we're not the only ones in this game and this regulatory effort has got to be effective but also responsive to that dynamic. Thanks.
Well, I think collaboration, even internationally, I don't think we can ignore any of the other stakeholders in this industry as well, because I think it's important. Yeah, we don't want any rough nation or rough sort of do anything that's wrong. So we still need to work together with the international organization that all maritime nations are a part of. But we still, of course, we need to drive it on, as I say, maybe in the U.S., test it out, show it that it can be done, and then that is a basis for international regulation. That's what we have seen on others, as well as LNG as a fuel has already started in certain areas and then been shown that it's purposely and can be safe, and then implemented globally.
As you were asking the question, Admiral, I was thinking back to your slide where you said government can help, right? And when you think about kind of what is the role of class, or what is the role of NEMO, or what is the role of the folks on the stage today, at the end of the day, the alignment of regulations internationally will rely on governments, and nuclear is much of a government fuel or a government solution as anything out there, and we would really look to our government to be a leading force in driving that kind of alignment and that speed of regulation to deal with the tension that you rightly point out.
Well, and I would also go and say that there are provisions in the regulations for test reactors and basically for prototypes, and I think that's what we are going to need to do, working hand in hand with the regulators to identify, what is the appropriate level of safety for these first of a kind that we're doing, so we can build it and get it done, because that will, be the basis for future regulations is being able to point to something that's out there operating. That makes it a lot easier. So I think we need to be aggressive with working hand in hand with the regulators to come up with appropriate solutions, and so we can get something done in 3 or 4 years as opposed to 10 years.
I'll add one thing just with my NRC hat on. The NRC has a concept called adequate protection, and it's basically defining how safe is safe enough. And I think it's really important that NRC or whoever is developing guidance or regulations for maritime nuclear figure that out up front and then have a consistent approach, not ratcheting up the requirements as we go along. And the NRC faced this with what we call Gen 3 plus reactors. There was a school of thought that, hey, these reactors are newer, they should meet a higher set of safety standards. And the commission itself had to weigh in and say, no, safe enough is safe enough. If they're safer than the current fleet, great. That might afford them some operational flexibility, things like that. But we're not going to keep ratcheting the safety standards up every 10 years or so. And so I think that's important in maritime as well. Let's figure out how safe is safe enough, regulate to that and not beyond. And that will, I think, provide the predictability and stability that the maritime nuclear industry needs.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I appreciate the question, Admiral. We want to be safe, but we want to be efficient and assertive because our real competition isn't between companies. As evidence, we have Blue Energy on our panel who is competition, but as we have heard from a previous discussion, there's a market share of $3 to $4 trillion. That's enough to go around between companies. Our real competition is Russia and China. We have to consider that. Appreciate the question.
And you can't have absolute safety. There's got to be some reasonable amount of risk. If you want complete absolute safety, then just don't build the reactor.
I think with that, we will close as we are out of time. I appreciate the expertise and great responses from our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.